for some people, the earliest texts that we have, some of the Psalms might be very ancient. Some other bits of poetry. Yeah, perhaps. Some people would argue even earlier, 12th century BCE, for some of the really early poetry that we find in Deuteronomy, for example. Others would argue that really, when we're talking about the first sort of coherent text, like a book or a scroll, some people say 7th century BCE, perhaps for a first edition, an early edition of some of the texts that we find in the Book of Kings, for example, an early edition of that, perhaps some form of Deuteronomy. Whereas most would agree that most of the compilation of the texts that as we now know them, occurs sometime in the Persian period, so from the 5th century BCE onwards.
Right, okay. And we'll come in due course to the question of whether there is disbelief and scepticism in the world of the Bible. But just to begin with, could you sketch out some of your position on the importance particularly of the Persian period as a formative moment in the Bible? Why is it that this period becomes, what events are conditioning the creation of the Bible as a document in the Persian period?
Theoretically, this is the point at which the elites from Jerusalem, and Jerusalem was basically the capital city of the Kingdom of Judah, this is the point at which the elites who have been exiled to Babylon with the expansion of the Neo-Babylonian Empire in the 6th century, they've been exiled to various places, Egypt and Babylon. The Babylonians were defeated by the Persians, and under Cyrus and his successors, you essentially get this idea that all of those displaced communities and populations around the ancient West Asian region are granted permission economically, politically and ideologically by the Persians to return to their homelands.
This is the world of the Cyrus cylinder.
Exactly. Yeah. And so what happens is, according to the Bible, a group of displaced elites from Jerusalem return to the city, rebuild the city, rebuild the Temple of Yhwh in Jerusalem, and rebuild their community. And as a part of that rebuilding of their community, a lot of traditions and perhaps older written sources are reworked and rebranded to create what we would essentially call the beginnings of an emergent Judaism. So this is the point at which you've got a shift in terms of the religious climate from a polytheistic Judahite religion, in which Yahweh is the head god presiding over a number of other deities, to a more monotheistic position in which supposedly Yahweh is the only deity worshipped by these people.
So just to get this absolutely right, you would date monotheism in a more thoroughgoing, intensified form to the Persian period, to the 6th, 5th century, and to this particular community of returning exiles.
It's a very slippery term, monotheism. It's very anachronistic, yes. Obviously. These people didn't necessarily believe that no other gods existed but Yahweh. Rather, what we're talking about is the very intensively promoted idea that Yahweh is prioritised over and above all other deities, so much so that those other deities tend to be relegated to lesser roles in the divine realm. And so ostensibly, it's a form of worshipping only Yahweh alone, but there are still other divine beings hanging around.
He's different in kind to the other gods, is he?
Yes.
Transcendent and not...
More increasingly transcendent, increasingly less talkative. Yeah. More reliant on heavenly mediators, so that's when you get the beginnings of these kind of angelic figures who are probably relatively demythologised forms of other minor deities that originally had a bigger role to play in a divine council or a divine assembly, but by the time we get to the Persian period, they've kind of been demoted, they're dropping down the tables.
Right, okay, right. And turning to the question of belief and disbelief, I mean, they're very slippery concept and very much contested, I'm aware. Guy Stroomser, in his interview, talked about the way in which questions of belief and disbelief were mobilised more as ways of attacking opponents in a monotheistic world. And he's talking, of course, about late antiquity, where you've got competing monotheisms, you've got Judaism, Christianity and Islam. But the language of disbelief, heresy and so forth is used to attack other peoples. It's not actually necessarily used so much for the community itself. I mean, Christians obviously define themselves as believers, but monotheism doesn't necessitate a concept of belief. Is that right? But you can describe other people as disbelievers, or so that the language of disbelief is used as a negative way of stigmatizing other groups.
To a certain extent, but in the Hebrew Bible, what you're faced with is this language of belief that just isn't really there. Belief is the language of confession. I believe X, Y, and Z, and it's a very Christian idea to state. It's staking a claim of allegiance and all of the theological trappings that go with that particular religious system. Whereas in the Hebrew Bible, it's not an issue about belief or non-belief. It's about power and potency of the deities. Is one deity stronger than another? Do you worship one deity or do you worship another? So it's much more about both the behaviour, the practice of the gods themselves and how they impact the human realm, and the behaviour and practice of the worshippers themselves and how that impacts the divine realm. So this idea about belief is actually quite alien to the Hebrew Bible.
Yes. But are there certain words, certain brands that are used to stigmatise people that are not part of the monotheistic community that is being defined in this particular world?
Well, the Hebrew Bible is, even though some of the texts and traditions about Yahweh and the other gods may be relatively early, by the time in the Persian period when a lot of these traditions are being reworked and repackaged to suit a more monotheistic perspective, there's an acknowledgement that other gods exist, obviously, because how do you say that Yahweh is the one true God if you're not trying to compete with the idea that there are other gods around?
There are other gods or other false gods?
Well, that's the thing. The gods who are worshipped by other people, who tend to be caricatured very much as sort of Canaanites or foreigners, these are the gods that were indigenous to Yahweh and his whole pantheon, and indigenous to ancient Israelite and Judahite religions. But they are vilified and they are othered by being made foreign. And by being made foreign, they're being made, not so, as some texts call them false gods, but really they're no gods. So in other words, they're demonised and ridiculed. They're vilified as manufactured objects. These are cult statues that are made by human hands. They don't eat, they don't breathe, they don't speak, they can't hear, they can't stand, they can't act. So therefore they're impotent. Whereas Yahweh is the God who speaks and listens and hears and acts and does.
And this is where the whole question of Israelite religion as an-iconic becomes important, is it? Because Israelite religion has a God which is not represented by human form. It's not represented by human creation.
Theoretically, yeah. So although you've got the prohibition of images in the Ten Commandments, lots of scholars think that this was probably either a later sort of development or was a part of a competing tradition. You could have an iconic representation of a god, a material representation of a god, like a standing stone, for example, that's iconic, so there's not actually imaged or sculpted.
Right.
So there are forms of iconic Yahweh worship. There's evidence of forms of iconic Yahweh worship in various periods, but it's in the Persian period that you get this real push towards aniconism, so no images at all. And so two reasons for that. Firstly, having a cult image is a pretty dangerous thing to have, because competing peoples, invading armies could come into your temple and they godnap your deity and destroy his cult statue, mutilate his cult statue, so physically and materially disempower that deity. So if you get rid of your cult statue, then your god is not at risk of being godnapped and cut up, basically. So that's one reason to move away from having a cult statue of a god in the first place. Another reason is that if you've got a cult statue of a deity, that god can be present in more than one sanctuary, and therefore you're risking, from a monotheistic perspective, pluralization. So Yahweh's cult statue in Samaria might be considered a different deity from Yahweh's cult statue in Jerusalem. So if you're pushing a monotheistic agenda, get rid of cult statues so that you can eliminate risk of pluralism.
Sure, yes.